Hi, everyone, and welcome to the final lecture of our online lecture series, The Future of AI, Social and Cultural Aspects. We had so far 12 fantastic lectures. All are available on our Institute's YouTube channel. And today with us, we have Kasia Jelinski, they are the co-founder of the Data Nutrition Project, an initiative that builds tools to mitigate bias in artificial intelligence, and a fellow at Stanford University and focused on building responsible data systems. Previously, they held positions at United Nations, US Digital Service, MIT Media Lab, McKinsey & Company, and Google. Today, they will talk about the importance of data standards and transparency tools to mitigate bias in algorithmic systems. The lecture title is Bias In, Bias Out, Building Better AI Through Data Transparency. Kasia, you can take over.
Great, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Everything's good? Okay, I'm really excited to be here with you all today. I would actually love to understand a bit about the folks in the room. So if you're able to, if you're not driving or something, if you want to drop kind of where you're tuning in from and what your background is, just very high level, that will help me to know where I should rush in this and where I should go more slowly. So if you just want to drop that in the chat and I'll kind of monitor that. I'll get started anyway with what I have here. So I'm going to dive in and share some slides. I'll probably talk for about, I don't know, 35, 40 minutes, something like that. And then would love to hear your questions if you have any. Very open talker, so you can just interrupt me if you want, put your hand up, or you can hold your questions to the end. It's all good for me. And I'm going to kind of walk through a range of topics from kind of what I'm seeing in industry after I introduce myself, and then talking a little bit about the problem of bias, and then some of the things that I've worked on to address some of that, and some of the directions in terms of policy that I'm seeing too, with a little bit of an eye towards generative AI, not because I particularly enjoy the hype, but because I do think it's quite salient at this moment, and there does seem to be a cultural flashpoint. So with that, I'm just going to jump on in and share my screen, if I can figure out how to do that. Here we go. All right, and then I'm going to hit slideshow. And can I just get a thumbs up if you can see the screen? Yeah, looks good. Great. Okay. So as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about AI and its risks, thinking a little bit about transparency through nutrition labels, which is a project that I co-lead, and then a little bit about policy implications. Try to keep it fairly global in nature, but as you can probably hear, I have an American accent. I'm based in New York. I'm American. I'm half Chinese, Cantonese actually, for those who are feeling political about it. But I am based in the US and I was educated here and I've lived my life here. So my name is Kasia. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a technologist. I'm currently focused on responsible data systems. And my background, though, is in building these systems, sometimes responsible and sometimes not, across a number of different domains. And I'm also a very enthusiastic cyclist and a bird watcher. So if you do have questions about birds, you can ask me those too. I am one of the leads of an organization called the Feminist Bird Club. So birding can also be somewhat political. So moving on, my background is, I like to say, fractalizing. It was fairly linear until it wasn't. I graduated with a degree in physics. I went to Harvard here in the US and realized that I really did not know how to speak to people, couldn't make eye contact, like all of the stereotypes, they were true about me. And so I actually left academia and ended up going to Google to work in comms, which was a very bizarre choice and one of the best ones that I've made because it taught me about narratives and messaging, about the importance of telling a story, and the fact, very importantly, towards my end at Google, that no matter how good the story is, it's very hard to make a bad product better. And so I decided that what I wanted to do is actually go into product management and be at the table, during the design phase, all the way through the build and the launch. And after that, I switched career tracks a little bit, ended up founding a company called Zest AI, which was in fintech. From there, went on to be the product lead at the MIT Media Lab Scratch project, which is the largest kids coding platform in the world. And then the election happened in the US, and I ended up going into the Trump administration and working in the White House, trying to fix failing technology projects. So if you do want to talk about bipartisan tech and what that means, possibly over a beer another time. Also happy to answer that. And finally, ended up at McKinsey in healthcare, where I was building data analytics pipelines for public sector clients through COVID. So a very interesting time to be working on that. Another thing happened though while I was in the White House. I started to reflect on some of what I had worked on before, realizing the great power and the responsibility that technologists have to address problems globally, and sometimes not do it well, and sometimes do it well, and really thinking about how that's we don't learn that when you are a product manager, for which there's no schooling, so you learn it on the ground. You're not really taught an ethics course, right? And so all the trade-offs that you make, you make on your feet, and sometimes with other people who have been in the industry longer, and sometimes you make the best choice that you have at the moment. And you have a lot of competing interests as a PM. You're managing teams of engineers and designers, but you're also managing up to the business. You have to be responsible for a bottom line, for revenue production, for growth. You might be talking to investors, depending on where you sit in the company. And you're doing this across domains that may or may not have a lot of regulatory overhead. So I really started to think about that. And that's when my bio fractalized. I started the Data Nutrition Project, which I'll talk more about, which is a data standards organization. I started doing more research at Harvard and Stanford, where I still am. I started advising on data strategy and kind of what responsible AI means. Not that I have the answers, but I had a lot of questions. And so people would kind of engage with me to highlight the questions that were relevant and think a little bit about what the answers might be. And there's no right answer. It ends up being a series of trade-offs. So I did that at the UN. I still am there. Partnership on AI, Mozilla, among others. And finally, leaning back into that the comms training that I got at Google, I realized that there's a huge gap between the work that we do as technologists and the things that we say in the media or in pop culture. And so I started doing some work around film and audio segments with radios and things like that. So that's my background. Let's dive into a little bit about at least what I've been seeing in the AI world. I'm going to open up the chat just in case people want to jump in with their chats. Yeah, great. And perfect. Yeah, if people want to drop their bios and who they are, I would kind of love to see it. I'll be watching it on the side just so I can make sure I'm tailoring this correctly. So when I say AI, I'm talking about the simulation of human intelligence by machines that are performing complex cognitive functions. People have different definitions of AI. I do think it's important to say that today our applications are narrow, right? So these are dedicated applications. They've been trained in a particular way. People might say that we're moving towards general AI. I think we're still far away from it, but there are glimmers, right? And general AI would be intelligent agents that are able to transfer information from domain to domain, right? So they're able to be trained in one way and then they can go and apply that in another way. One way to explain this would be that you would not ask your GPS device, which uses AI, which brand of chicken to buy, because it doesn't know, right? But an intelligent agent might be able to actually jump from one domain to another, from where it was trained to someplace where it wasn't, and answer questions that are outside of that realm. And again, some people will say we're there. I don't think we're there. We might be tending there with generative AI, which sounds like general AI, but is a different thing. And then super AI. This is the kind of beyond human intelligence magnitudes of more intelligence than humans have. And I do not think we're there, but people like to talk about that. And I think a lot of the folks who are talking about existential risk and about the end of humanity and these kinds of things are thinking about the super AI. Again, today, mostly in the narrow AI. And these are the tasks that you would be familiar with, things like self-driving cars, recommendations for advertising, bots that play chess, etc. So the reason that AI has grown so quickly, there's kind of three reasons here. There's compute power. So there's tons of resources that are used to train these AIs, these systems, the availability of data, which is increased tremendously, and advanced mathematics. Arguably right now, when we're looking at the generative AI spike, what you're seeing is really 1 and 2 and not so much 3. We've kind of have been, we know about the mathematics that have gone into generative AI for quite some time, but it is amazing when you increase the other two, what you do see. And there are many different kinds of AI. For the last decade, we've really been talking about supervised learning, a few other kinds of techniques as well, unsupervised learning, reinforcement learning, but mostly supervised learning. And this, again, is how the self-driving cars and the ads recommendations, the spam filters, all of those kinds of things work. The next decade, probably moving towards generative AI, as we've already seen with GPT and Llama 2 and Falcon and all these others. And so this is kind of a prediction from Andrew Ng from Stanford University, who says that the next decade, we're probably going to see that blue bubble grow, but probably we'll also continue to see a lot of supervised learning. This is the AI that's mostly in production today, so we should not forget about it. If we want to talk a bit about examples of what this is going to mean for normal people, the bottom line is that people will be able to build things with AI and interact using their native language, English, Spanish, Chinese, whatever they speak, instead of having to code things. So it's going to go straight to consumer. As I've mentioned before, supervised learning's discrete recommendations, generative AI like GPT, it's building new information that is based on patterns of old information. So they predict the next word or object, next object like a word or a pixel based on some prompt that you give it. And so this is kind of the major shift that we're seeing right now. What this really means, if you start to look at the landscape, and it's crazy. I probably wrote these slides a month ago, and it's like everything is changing so rapidly. So this might be incredibly obvious at this point. But what we expect to see is this explosion of applications that are built on top of these foundation models. So when we think of this as a stack, right? The bottom, you have compute hardware, you've got platforms that allow you to run everything in the cloud, and then you're going to have your foundation models on top, like your GPTs and your open options, your open models. And then on top of that, you're going to have applications. And you can kind of think of this analogously to the mobile landscape, where at some point, if you remember, if you're old and crusty like I am, at some point, there were a million apps that just exploded onto the scene because there was an app store and you could have apps on your phone. And before that, your phone was really pretty dumb. You could just text and you could call. Maybe you had data, maybe. But then all of a sudden, everyone had data. Everyone had a phone that was smart in the Western world within a certain kind of socioeconomic class. And a bunch of apps were exploding on the scene to allow you to take advantage of that. That is what we're probably going to see with AI, and that we're already seeing with things that are built on top of and being deployed on top of these foundation models. One thing to focus on that is definitely playing out as I'm speaking is that there's a real debate right now in open versus closed with this approach. So the closed models are the proprietary models that you have to interact with by purchasing, access to the API and various credits, or you have to log into another environment and look at things there, versus the open model, which is kind of analogous to open source with code, but it's not exactly the same thing because a model is quite complicated and different parts of it can be open and accessible in different ways. But these two approaches are quite different. And I liked this internal Google email that was leaked just a few months ago, where Google was saying, oh, we're fighting against OpenAI, or we're fighting against these various other players. And what we haven't realized that there's a third faction, which is the open source world, that is cheaper, faster, getting things out there way more rapidly, and that they're actually eating our lunch. So all these companies are fighting each other, and then you've got the open source world. Since I pulled this lovely slide together, there's actually a letter in support of openness from Mozilla that was signed by a lot of very prominent scientists. So if you're interested in this kind of conversation, I would go there, look at the names, and then start Googling from there. And so, this is kind of just a continuation of talking a bit about what this landscape is going to look like. You'll have all of these different services that will be built on top of the foundation models, either open or closed, open or proprietary, and you can already see that's happening. So this, I think, was a screenshot from a VC firm. Actually, a lot of what I'm able to find is through VCs because you can just look at where the money's going. And these are the kinds of companies that are already getting funded to go build these types of services. It turns out, and I'd love to hear if people are using generative AI in their own work, but a lot of organizations, and this was conducted in San Francisco, so I think it's quite US focused, but it says global executives. I don't know what that means. If you're going to something in San Francisco, I think it indicates you're a certain kind of set of businesses. But a vast majority of businesses are already using GPT. And this was several months ago, 3 or 4 months ago. So what you see here is that people are experimenting, they're starting to implement in operations, and there are some folks who are either they've decided not to, very small minority, and others that are kind of like, I'm not really sure, or I'm kind of looking into it. And sometimes I get this question, how are folks actually starting to manage the use of GPT in the classroom or in the office? And so there are a few kind of components here. The first is internal usage versus kind of usage that is going to be external facing in some way. A lot of folks are saying you can use things internally, but anything externally, there has to be a human in the loop, or you're just banned from doing anything externally. And that would be, for example, making newsletter copy or something. You could have a person who is using GPT to generate newsletter copy or marketing copy, but then you have to keep a human in the loop and actually review everything before you publish it. And other places are saying, nope, you just can't use it for anything external facing. But if internally you want to take all your notes from the meeting and you want to throw them through something and you want to turn it into a summary for your own self and your own team, and you're going to use this for internal communications only, then go ahead and do that. Second is that there are a lot of existing policies. So there are organizations, I've been working with somebody who's doing this at Harvard and thinking more deeply about this at Harvard. There are a lot of existing digital tools policies or digital policies, right? So kind of similar to when social media came on the scene and all of a sudden all the organizations had to start thinking about what is our policy with regards to social media? Well, they could kind of look at some other communications policies that they already had. And so that's happening too in organizations. People are saying, well, what are the existing digital tools policies that we have? For example, you can only use the following allowable software. So then organizations are signing up for the enterprise version of GPT. You can use that, but you can't use others. Or in schools, they're looking a lot at plagiarism policies and saying, okay, we don't allow students to plagiarize. Perhaps using GPT is something like plagiarism or cheating on some level. And so you have to cite it, otherwise it will be seen as plagiarism. Or things like copyright. So if there's something about IP restriction and copyright, that can then be tweaked to also apply to generative AI. And finally, this one's a big one. There's a lot of scrutiny around what information you're putting into these models, knowing that the models themselves are being retrained on the data that you're giving it. So if you're entering confidential information, like let's say I have a bunch of medical records, and so my medical records have all my PII. It has my name, it has my gender, it has all this information about my body. And I take all of that and I think this is just my internal usage is okay. And I take all that information, I put it into a model, and then I ask it to summarize it for me. Well, that information that I've put into the model is potentially fair game now for that company to use to retrain their model. Right. So these kinds of things you really want to be careful about. And then if somebody were to be clever and, basically find a way around, trick the model, it's possible that you could trick the model into giving you back the confidential information about other people, right? So quite dangerous there in terms of usage policies. So maybe I'll pause there for a second if there's like any questions or any thoughts so far. Cool, I'll keep going. Feel free to just move yourself off mute. I'm sorry about my mouse moving around it's like a massive dashboard over here. So risks from AI. People sometimes talk about unbiased AI. Very sorry to burst the bubble, but it is not possible to remove all the biases, nor is it the goal. This is a very simplistic image of, basically a two-dimensional space where you have approved and rejected, let's say, loan applicants, right? And so if you're looking at times when people paid you back and times when people didn't pay you back, and now you're making an AI that will predict whether a new applicant is somebody who is more like the green section or the gray section, you are making a decision that is biased, right? That is actually the point of the AI, is that you are biased in some way. The goal here is to understand and control the way that the AI is actually making decisions. And so that's very important to understand. You're not trying to remove all of the biases because it's not actually possible. Now, when we think about where and how harm emerges inside of a system, first of all, AI is not a single product. It is a system, right? It starts with the world as we see it, and us trying to figure out why and how an AI system might be beneficial to the way that we move in the world. And then we collect data on that world to start to build a training data set so that we can train our AI to make decisions. And so at the point of the human society, there's already a bunch of inequities, right? And a bunch of issues that we might not want to replicate. Then we go into the measurement and the data collection component where we're actually gathering information. So let's say that I want to make a model that's going to predict the scores of kids who are taking exams, right? I need to now go and get a bunch of scores from people in the real world so I can train my machine to make a certain kind of classification. Now, this is an issue because I might misrepresent these kids. I might be reinforcing harmful categories. I might have to label this data, right? And if I'm labeling it, I might be using humans to label my data, and the humans might come with their own biases. There might be folks who are not included, right? And then also, what do we do about surveillance and privacy? So there's a lot of components here that emerge during the data collection and processing part of this diagram. Then we actually build our AI model. So the model has goals, objectives. We train that model, like I showed you on the previous slide. We are deciding on some type of a classification scheme in traditional AI. And how are we defining those things, right? So that's another area where bias or harm can kind of slip in. And then we're training the model. So there's some technical decisions that we have to make here. And then we deploy that model, and ultimately the model is going to impact the world. And so really harm and bias can kind of creep in at any point in this cycle. And it's important to notice that it's, not just a product. It's not just about this number 3 part, which is the model development. It's about the whole thing, right? And you have to have a holistic view when you're building AI. So if you can identify the bias, you can find a path to mitigation, right? So if the issue, I won't go through all of these, but for example, in the world, if you're building an AI that is going to predict leadership qualities, and you're looking at historical data about CEOs, well, CEOs in the world historically are overwhelmingly white and male, and actually currently as well, right? Maybe not in the future. But if we're building AI that's based on the past, which is how most AI is built, / all AI, then we really need to be careful about the selection in the training data, right? How are we actually including representatively the entire population or the population that we want to represent so that the AI that we build doesn't just replicate the issues in the past? And I won't go through all of these, but another one I think is interesting is this definition of fairness, right? So some people, I've worked with teams that say, can we just make sure that this AI is fair? And it's actually, there are mathematically many definitions of fairness. And you cannot satisfy all the definitions of fairness at the same time. It's actually mathematically impossible. So one example I'll give you here is, let's say that you have a medical condition that affects people who have a certain biology, and not everybody has that biology. So let's say, male and female, if you want to go binary. If you want to build an AI that is fair with respect to how many of each category have a positive result. So let's say you're testing for a kind of cancer. Well, if somebody doesn't have the body part, then you probably can't find cancer in it. But if your definition of fairness is that each category needs to have the same rate of positive outcome, meaning yes, there is cancer, then now you've forced it to be fair in this way, but it's actually going to give you skewed results in terms of false negatives and false positives, right? So it's not actually possible to kind of support all definitions of fairness at the same time. So when we think about issues that are caused by algorithms and systems, this probably is not news to many people, but there are a number of categories. There's discrimination against certain individuals. There's distortion of information when they're kind of filter bubbles. There's exploitation of sensitive information. We talked a little bit about generative AI, just pulling up people's sensitive information. And then there's misjudgment in terms of incorrect predictions or classifications. This is going to be exacerbated and extended by generative AI, right? So some new risks here, the fact that generative AI is quite inaccurate. So they will respond with inaccurate information because they don't have a very strong logical underpinning. They're just like predicting the next thing in the sentence. Also, very, very easy to create synthetic content. This is delightful when you're doing something funny. Like I recently made a deep fake of my aunt singing like a very old and famous Cantonese pop song. That was hilarious. It was awesome, right? It's pretty scary though, when you can very, very quickly create, let's say, the president of the United States saying things that he didn't say, right? And then having people believe that that's actually the stance of America or the stance of other nations. Data privacy and copyright issues. So what happens is, as I mentioned, generative AI that's been trained on data that has PII, that has personally identifiable information or copyrighted information, will then you can actually then recreate that information by somebody else. So if I put in all of my information, someone might actually receive my information because my information has now been used to train that AI. Cybersecurity, it'll be it already is quite easy to create malicious codes, spam, and other attacks, or identify new threat vectors through something like generative AI. And finally, I really like this one because it's a little bit sci-fi. Model collapse is quite interesting. It's basically the notion of if you train models on data that was created by the models, they get worse and worse. Their performance doesn't just stay the same. It's actually a loss of diversity of information, which means that over time, their worldview narrows and narrows and narrows and narrows. So think about it. You have all this AI that's now building all the copy on the internet. So now you have people who, instead of writing a blog post, will throw an outline into GPT. It spits out the blog. They just publish it. Well, now all this information on the internet has been created by the models that will then be retrained on the exact same text. And then you have something like model collapse. So the kind of the performance of the models actually degrades over time. And then, not to mention societal impact, you have workforce implications, right? Automation of jobs, but also the fact that there are a lot of low-paid outsourced jobs that are happening, similar to content moderation, that don't have any standards, or people are actually harmed in this way because of the content that they're seeing and the work conditions. Another thing I think I didn't actually put on here, right, is that AI is also being used to manage the workforce itself and to kind of push towards more and more extreme productivity, right? So you have stories of folks who are in warehouses who are going by the clock, and the clock is being managed by AI, not humans, giving them shifts that are back to back or other kinds of things that are just really not tenable for the human body. And finally, environmental impact. These machines and these systems take a tremendous amount of energy. And this isn't necessarily in the lexicon when you're talking to people who are building machines right now, but I imagine that it will be. This is my perspective. I think that frustratingly, a lot of the focus is on the existential risks, that kind of super AI of, oh my goodness, there's, the models are gaining consciousness and all these kinds of things. Yes, maybe non-zero chance, but like I said before, AI is already being used in production. A lot of this kind of old school AI, right? The supervised learning, and it's already affecting people quite negatively, sometimes positively as well, and also quite negatively. So I think what we need to do is focus on the consolidation of power and control in the hands of the few. The OpenAI debacle that happened over the last few weeks has been fascinating. I was watching it on the side, just eating my popcorn, and I think what we saw was the same people are invested, right, who are then leaving, going to join those companies that had investment, coming back into the board. If you look at the new board, a lot of the same faces that you saw at places like Twitter and places like Google, and it's all the same folks who already have power, who are further consolidating that power in this new direction. This graph, I think, is fascinating. So the blue is academia, and I want to draw your attention to what has happened to the blue line over time. So this is, the number of places, the sources of notable AI systems over the last 70 years. And what you see is, as you might expect, a lot of great stuff happening in academia. And then ostensibly that kind of moves into industry over time. But in the last 5 years, there's been this massive consolidation inside of industry. So most of what's actually happening now is happening not in academia, which is maybe more neutral, maybe more open, maybe more collaborative, but rather inside of industry, behind closed doors for proprietary reasons and for proprietary deployment. So this is kind of, I think, the real risk area that is not really related to the Terminator coming and killing us all, but rather about humans, because it's often about humans with too much power making decisions that affect a vast majority of the world. So maybe I can talk about some happy things. Talking a little bit about maybe my positionality in this. My journey is really, as I mentioned, as a product manager in industry. And what I found over time was that I was taught, and I was being taught, and I was being encouraged to think about this problem as a build for the majority first and then build for the minority. Now, the thing is that it depends on your definition of majority. I mean, I actually think that probably it's not the majority of the world, but maybe the majority of the wealth in the world. And you're really building for the middle of this bell curve. And outside of this are folks that you'll get to later. People who don't have a binary gender, maybe they use assistive devices, they share their technology, they don't speak English, they don't have the most recent technology, they're not in a city, right? And so as a product manager, you're taught like build for the middle and then move out over time. Now, the problem is that, very personally, a lot of my life is outside of the majority. And so I kept building products that did not work for me or my family. And it was really a kind of a shocking realization. And then over time, recognizing that people who are outside of this will start to trust the technology less and less, and you start to have a more antagonistic relationship with technology over time. So the way that I kind of have come to see this is that transparency is very, very important. It is necessary, although not sufficient, to rebuild the trust over time, right? If you have transparency into your design decisions, into your technology, and by that I mean disclosure of what's actually happening, access for researchers, for media, openness in terms of your approach, publishing what you're doing, that then drives collaboration, communication, maybe even accountability. And that can signal care, can also actually cause recourse. Like there can be real things that change. There can be communities who actually receive some kind of benefits over time that were cut out of the system previously. And maybe even you can start to rebuild that trust. So in 2018, I joined a fellowship that was at Harvard and MIT called Assembly. There are a bunch of us who were there who kind of mid-career taking a break from burnout. And we were tasked with thinking about how could you do something that would meaningfully impact ethical AI. And it was kind of a nascent field at the time. It was 2018, so it was a little bit early. And what my group started to see was that, not surprisingly today, but a little bit surprisingly at that time, systems that are built on problematic data exhibit the same issues, as I've already kind of mentioned, especially for folks who are already cut out of a lot of mainstream technology and deployment. These are just some semi-recent examples, going kind of recent to less recent, of things that have happened to people in the media, right? So on the left, you have somebody who was caught by the police saying that he had done something because the facial recognition picked him out of a lineup. But actually, the facial recognition system was not built using a representative sample of human faces, did not have a lot of people with darker skin color. And so it just doesn't do well on darker skin colors. So that model is problematic for that reason. And then obviously he was not the guy who perpetrated the crime. And so that really sucked for him. In the middle, you've got suicide risk prediction models. So this is you come into a clinic or something, you're exhibiting certain symptoms. They run this through an AI, and it tells the provider the likelihood that you are a suicide risk. Well, again, those models were not built on representative data sets. So a lot of minoritized populations were not included in the original training data, meaning that there are people who come in who might be a risk, who might need to have access to those kinds of that kind of healthcare, that kind of care. And the model is saying that they're not a risk, right? Because it wasn't actually trained to identify them because of their population. And then finally, Amazon created this hiring tool. It was built on historic data, a lot of which resumes from before of people who had been hired for jobs. And it turns out that historically the world has been quite biased against women. And so the new model, not surprisingly, could pick up whether somebody was female and then would deny them the job. So these are examples, and there are many, many more. And so we thought, hey, shouldn't we be interrogating the data for bias before we build the model? Right? I know that sounds obvious, but it's very much not what's happening today. Right? So you get a data set, you process that data set, you develop the model, you deploy it. And then this is what happens, right? So what happens normally in industry is you go all the way through the pipeline and then you see if there's any problems. Now, that's not 100%. People are checking along the way, but there are really no standards or tools at the data set level to be checking for bias, especially in 2018. There have been, the ecosystem has grown quite a bit since that time, which is quite positive. But at the time, we were thinking, hey, should we not have something like a nutrition label, like on food, right? So you can look at what's inside a data set before your model eats it. Just like how if I'm going to go and try to decide which kind of cookie I should buy to eat, I would want to know what is in the cookie, I mean, depending on how much you want to eat the cookie, maybe you just eat any cookie. But let's say that like I am a celiac, right? I can't actually eat gluten. Well, it's very important that I look at what's inside before I eat it. So we thought, why don't we try to do the same thing? So this is a team. We are a collective of interdisciplinary experts, and we started out as this little project inside of this fellowship. We launched the actual first version, which is on the top here, and we had a white paper, and then the fellowship ended, and we shut it down. And then we kept getting phone calls, and people were like, hey, where's that nutrition label? And we're like, oh, it's just like a project. I mean, it doesn't really, we have something and we like it, but you could use this as a foundation and build something else on top of it. We got calls from all the major tech companies saying, oh, do you want to come work here? And we're like, no, we think it's important that it stay independent. And they're like, well, how can it be independent if you don't exist? So we decided to become a collective, and that's when we became a nonprofit. Our second version, which is in the middle, was very, very opinionated and very focused on kinds of bias. We had these kind of alert counts by category. And we realized that was very hard. It's very hard to be the arbiter of, what is bias and what is not. It's also incredibly dependent on where in the world you are and what the social categories are, how you define gender, how you define race. Is the goal for things to be representative? Or do you want to overrepresent so that you can start to mitigate some of the issues in society? So we moved away from that version, which we thought was maybe too opinionated. And we now have landed on this third version, which is totally open. You can build your own labels if you go to the website. And what it aims to do is highlight things that you should know when you're choosing to use a data set. So there's information like, what's the intended use? How has it been used? How should it not be used? Right? And then what are the kinds of things you might need to know in terms of the way that the data has been defined, the data definitions, who's paying for it, how often it will be updated, these kinds of things. I do want to point out, we're not the only ones in this ecosystem. It's an amazing ecosystem, very rich and changing all the time. These are some of the other projects that exist along this spectrum here. If you look in the middle, there's a cycle of the world, the data, the model, the launch, and the running of the model. And you can see that there are all of these transparency approaches at different points in the life cycle. I'll point out that I think us and the data statements work are the only ones that are not inside of a tech company. And the data statements work is supported through a university on the West Coast in the US. So we're really the only tiny nonprofit on this page. And that has been both challenging and also kind of amazing just to be seen as and to be independent in the space when there's a lot of big players. But we all talk to each other. We all know each other. Folks actually have moved from one team to the other. And we all believe very strongly that transparency is the first and the most important step when it comes to starting to build accountability and starting to mitigate some of these issues in these systems. So we are an approach, like I said, we've talked to all those folks. We're a methodology. Since we're open, people can take pieces of what we have and they can implement them at their own organizations. And we're also, basically a standard. And so we have NeurIPS, for example, in 2021 was the first time that they mentioned that people could actually submit their data sets with nutrition labels on them. And we're kind of named in a bunch of other places. So I'm coming towards the end here, so you get your questions ready. People do ask a bunch about policy trends, and what I've been seeing at least, and this is from State of AI 2023, if you haven't seen that report, it's pretty amazing. There are a few different approaches here. There's kind of relying on existing laws and regulations. You've got introducing AI-specific frameworks, which is happening in some places. And then there are some places that are just like, you can't use it. I will say that we seem to be kind of moving away from banning things, but there are still places that are just saying until this meets certain local regulations, you just can't use the following technology. I mean, I would say that, history shows us that people tend to get around these types of things. So for the most part, what I've been focusing on are the left-hand two circles. Do you rely on existing laws that are domain specific? So let's say, particular laws in the medical domain about technology and its use on patients, or do you build entirely new legislation like the EU AI Act? And I think that it's right now we're just kind of seeing what shakes out. But this is kind of generally speaking what we're seeing in the ecosystem. I think some high level trends, regulation is certainly coming. We know it's coming. EU is kind of first in the Western world, I guess. China already has launched a bunch of regulation that's quite interesting. Until then, you have a lot of self-regulation, a lot of voluntary commitments. You have a lot of commitments that are being stated by countries with the tech folks in the wings who are helping to draft a lot of that, at least in the US. There is a huge focus on the major tech platforms, which is probably right because they do have an outsized amount of power and they are fueling a lot of the fundamental technology components. I do think, though, that we are going to want to think about small tech and application developers down the line because that is where the technology actually meets the humans, right? So if we're going to be interacting with all these services that are built on top of GPT, who is liable for that? Is it the folks who built on top of GPT, or is it GPT, right? And you know, OpenAI is going to point to the developers, and the developers are going to point to GPT. They're going to point to OpenAI. So that's definitely something that I think we're going to see over time is a shift towards the smaller tech players as well. And this question of, you know, are we focused on risk or use-based application? So we're going to regulate something based on how you use it or how it should or should not be used, or its risk level, as opposed to regulating the technology as a whole. And that's definitely something that's also emerging. Other areas to watch here, copyright battles. This is where we're seeing a lot of the front lines in terms of people actually moving into the courts, asking real questions about AI. Workers' rights. So, you know, if your job is controlled by AI or you're working in the AI sector, you know, what does this mean with respect to what your liberties are? What kind of rights do you actually have? What kind of recourse do you have? And this is certainly made more complicated by the fact that a lot of these jobs are outsourced. So you're in a Western country, and a lot of this kind of labor is getting pushed out to the global South, which is not a new paradigm, right? But it is a new domain in which this is happening. There will certainly be a lot of requirements that come out in the upcoming regulation about transparency reporting. So you're going to create all this documentation, which is going to force transparency. It's going to force accountability, but then who's actually going to check that? And where's it going to go? What kind of recourse does it have, right? So if you're thinking about nutrition labels on food, there's an entire part of the government that enforces that checks it, that audits that, and that can enforce, right? So you can actually go and give fees to folks who are lying. You can actually shut down those companies. Well, how's that going to work in the AI space? So there'll probably be an emergence, there will be an emergence of an auditing market, a credentialing market. Synthetic media, huge risk. We have a bunch of, we have geopolitical situations now that we're seeing in terms of the creation of fake media. And I think the upcoming elections that are happening in the US and also, you know, in Taiwan and China and, you know, all across the world, we're going to be seeing the increased presence of fake information. And then finally, environmental impact, which, like I said before, not a huge conversation inside of tech, but I do think that the public pressure and the increasing kind of political pressure should, I hope, highlight this for the technology sector as well, which will have consequences just given how infrastructure intensive AI really is. So that is a whirlwind tour of kind of AI, what I'm seeing emerging here, some of the work that I do around transparency and the importance of transparency, and finally, some of the kind of policy implications and the trends to watch. I am more than happy to talk about any of this. I'll take myself off of screen share so I can see your faces. Oh, there's somebody who also has a cow face, which is great. Yeah, so thank you so much, and I'm very happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Cassia. You opened so many questions. I have a few, but first I'd like people who joined us today to start first. Anyone, if you have a question or comment for Cassia, just unmute and yeah.
Hi, I have one question, if that's okay to start.
Yeah.
So that was excellent. Thanks a lot. Really, really great. The question is that individually we have very limited leverage over this technology, even if we're working with it ourselves. If we're concerned about the risks associated with AI and real life risks, not X risks or anything hypothetical, if we're concerned about those risks, how should we prioritize them and the risk actors in order to take action? You've painted a very broad picture of a risk landscape, but what's the approach that you take to where you put your attention? Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Really like coming out swinging there. It's a big one. I think there are several components of it, and I think that just my own background biases me towards thinking about the data and the data collection. And so I do personally have pretty stringent data practices about who gets my information and how and when. And I see everything as a trade-off. So there are some services that I've signed up for because they're convenient. I need them. Work requires them. It's how we communicate, Zoom, for example. And there are always choices that you could make to go with smaller software companies or companies with very clear data policies, but then the folks aren't necessarily on those technologies. Or like, for example, I have a Linux machine. Man, it's very complicated to set things up sometimes. There's nothing that's plug and play, right? So, I mean, I think that there's a trade-off. There's a series of trade-offs. And so that is how I approach it, is being aware as much as I can be, and then approaching everything as a series of trade-offs. That's personally how I think of it. So do I want to sign up for this? Can I go into my settings and turn off tracking? Should I be cycling through? Should I be using single sign-ons, or should I create something new every time, even though it's kind of a pain in the butt? These kinds of small things that help me at a personal level make the types of trade-offs that I decide that I want to make. In terms of a larger kind of societal look, or what we can do as citizens, I do think that putting pressure on our elected officials to think about AI legislation and regulation is very important. I think that holding tech companies accountable. There is a conversation right now about the importance of watermarking, right? So the notion is that if I encounter an AI, I should know it's an AI. If I encounter information that was created by an AI, I should know that. And right now, that is not the case. And people will say, hey, that's technically very, very hard. Well, there are a lot of really smart people, and if there's enough pressure, someone will come up with a solution, right? It's about directing the pressure in a way that's going to reallocate the resources at these tech companies to solve these kinds of problems. So that's something that we can do, I think, as citizens, as people, is really continue to apply that pressure within the political process. So those are kind of two approaches. And I think that for those who work in the tech industry, there's an even better approach, which is to put on pressure from the inside. And that has been fairly successful within tech companies over the last few years. I say fairly because I know a lot of the folks who, led the tech workers walkout at Google, and their lives got messy after, right? I mean, there is real retaliation that happens, whether intentionally or unintentionally, inside of these companies. But I do think you're hugely powerful if you work for one of these companies and you can get people en masse to essentially unionize, or at least have some kind of a display of solidarity with a business decision, to kind of push the company in a different direction. In that case, it was about working with DoD, with defense in the US, and it did change the course of that project. So those are just a few strategies that I've seen kind of on the individual level, on the societal level, and then also if you happen to be somebody who works in or with tech companies.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Do you have some more questions? Okay, I have a few. But I'd like to kind of continue with the previous one about policy making, actually. So, for example, in your data nutrition project, how do you like practically get to the decision makers, and what is the way to really systematically implement them, on the state level, let's say?
Yeah, I think it's, we haven't figured it out. So just to be totally honest, if people have ideas as well, very happy to hear them. I think that what we have found that works, that we feel fortunate about, is that we have a metaphor that people understand very quickly. And we're not the first folks to think about nutrition labels. Obviously, we're borrowing that from food. That's also been something that's been used to think about privacy. to think about cybersecurity, and now to think about data transparency, model transparency, right? It's a very neat narrative about transparency. We want to look inside and have the ingredients and have the percent daily values and be given some kind of a score before you decide what you want to do, or as a way to actually help you determine what you want to do with that data, that model, that whatever, that application. So starting with a very easy to explain message has been helpful for us. We have talked to a lot of folks in the US and Europe in particular about the work that we do and kind of the principles of it. That's been useful to get the conversation started. We've also had to then shift the conversation a little bit because people are not full, they don't fully understand. A lot of these folks who are building policy do not also build AI. So their understanding of what AI is and what it isn't, and how we can actually interact with it or control it, or regulate it, help it, guide it along, they don't have the right frame of mind when it comes to it, or it's limited in some way. So for example, pointing out that AI is not a product, it is a process, that has been a huge shift. And to talk to policymakers and say, you want to regulate the deployment of the AI, I understand, but you also need to think about the development of the AI. And maybe you don't want to reach all the way into a tech company and regulate that, but there are ways to essentially require documentation, to require transparency into the process. When you actually then publish that AI, when you deploy that AI, maybe there are things you have to tell people about how it was actually trained. A good example of this is when you have AI that is going to be used in a medical context, it's very important to know how that AI was trained. Not just about its deployment, how much it's going to cost, and transparency into pricing structures and these kinds of things, not just market transparency, but actually who it was trained on, what kind of data was actually used to train that AI. Because if I'm going to take this AI that was built in New York City and I'm going to go and I'm going to launch it in rural China, those populations might be different enough in the thing that they are tracking that the AI is actually not going to work very well. So it's very important that I understand this component, which is really about the process of AI, not the product. So there have been conversations like that, and there are a few other areas too, where we've sat down with policymakers and explained that the way they think about AI needs to shift a little. And so having that conversation and bringing people to the table is important. We haven't been super focused on saying the nutrition label is the only way, but we have been very focused on saying, look at the data. There needs to be some accountability and some transparency into the data. So when we talk about generative AI, what is generative AI trained on? Why did Bing chat or whatever sound like a teenager? What data was it trained on? Probably a bunch of teenagers' data, right? I'm just making that up. But there's no requirement for these organizations to even tell us how they trained that model, and that is dangerous. So a lot of the conversations we've been having have been pointing out these kinds of areas and saying, we don't know what the exact answer is in terms of regulation. It might be different depending on the domain, on the geography, on the other laws that you already have or that you don't already have. But you should be thinking about things like the AI as a process. So think about the development and the deployment and the use, not just the use. Think about the data, please, because the highest level of safety you can have is the data. And it just degrades from there. High quality data, that's the highest quality AI. And after that, it gets lower. And other things like that we kind of bring up to policymakers.
Thank you. I just had another question which kind of escaped my mind. By the end, somewhere by the end of your talk, you mentioned transparency and also ethics. Actually, it was at the beginning when you said that there's no ethics in engineering. So my question is how to implement it into engineering. Would be some kind of collaboration with ethicists or interdisciplinary teams, or what would be the practical way to get ethics into the engineering, which means in the model making and also selection of data.
Yeah, I saw there's lots of philosophers who are here. So this is maybe a question for you all as well. I think from my experience, it is not rocket science, and people are building what is being measured, right? So you will build what is measured. So if what's measured is how much money the company makes, or how many people click on the thing that you create, or how many people in the process get from point A to point B, whether it's signups or completion of the game, or clicking on the ad, or whatever it is, there's something that's getting incentivized. There's something that's getting counted. For engineers, it might be how much code they can produce, how quickly, if they can hit their milestones, right? And so I think that we have to start with saying, what are the metrics that the engineers are being judged on? It's tied directly to their livelihood, their bonus, their salary, right? Whatever it is. And we need to think about what would it mean to have ethics metrics. Now that might be, you might be allergic to that idea as philosophers. That's okay. That's why I'm here. I'm here to kind of be the voice of practicality. When you're on a team and someone says, hey, I need you to document your process before you launch, but I'm not going to give you more time. I'm just going to tell you you have to do it in addition to everything you're doing already. I don't do a good job because I'm motivated by the thing, getting the thing out the door so I can make my paycheck. If you've given me no additional time or space to do those other things, if you've given me no way to really think ethically about what I'm doing or the trade-offs, and there's no real practical way of making a different decision because the person who makes the decision has already made it anyway, and I'm just running towards a launch date, well, then you're not going to see an introduction of ethics. Except in the case you have a person who has a really strong moral conscience and really wants to do the right thing, and maybe they'll fight from the inside. And so I'm not saying a tech industry is bad. I'm not saying tech companies are terrible. I don't think people are unethical. I just think that people are motivated by a certain set of metrics and a certain set of goals, especially when you are a tiny company and you have investment from venture capital. You have a bunch of people on the board, you have a bunch of investors who are really kind of every quarter when you talk to them, they're saying, how are you going to grow? Did you grow? Did you hit your metrics? Did you hit the user base you need? And that is the motivation. There's not a ton of space for things like ethics. So I think when we're talking about industry, there needs to be space and like real adoption of the ability for people to make different decisions. Maybe we need to incentivize that by having metrics that you're actually running towards. I don't know what that is. I mean, for example, something like social media, you're talking about engagement. And that's the metric, is if you're engaged, meaning you're clicking, you're scrolling, you're looking, that's positive. What if we changed that and it was happiness, right? And the metric was, are your users happy? And you had a survey that you asked them every once in a while, and you tried to understand whether people are happy, right? How would that change the way that you build your social media platform? I don't even know how you'd measure that, but that's the kind of thing we need to think about. And then, so that's kind of an industry. I think if you think about before industry, about the education process, there are a lot of great folks who are building data science curriculum and engineering curriculum. I know folks who are doing this at Harvard. I know folks at Stanford are doing this. University of Washington is doing this. I know mostly American universities are doing this. But really trying to incorporate lessons or case studies about trade-offs, about privacy, cybersecurity, about building technology that's deployed in a military context or in a way that's kind of colonialist. And trying to build that into the education of students who previously maybe would have just had a more technical education. So it's certainly happening at that level as well.
Fantastic, thank you. We have two more questions. One is in the comments. How is it possible to make the developers companies think about responsible application of AI when there are multiple stakeholders in different jurisdictions, groups of interest who compete severely?
Yeah. I wouldn't have even noticed the spelling error and severely. So I appreciate that attention to detail. Yeah, I mean, this is really hard. Multiple stakeholders in different jurisdictions. Just thinking. So as a product manager, my role was often to be the liaison between these different stakeholders. That's actually like the role of product manager. So you are like a mini CEO of your product, but you report to the CEO of the company or somebody higher up on the product roadmap, or the, you know, maybe head of engineering or CTO or something like that. And then you also have your team that you're working with, so you're managing them day to day. And maybe you have to balance the requirements from the marketing side, legal, you know, the business side, biz dev, as well as, you know, communications, all these other folks. I think, like I said before, there's no right answer. There's no single right answer. It's a series of trade-offs. And so it becomes a conversation among these different stakeholders, sometimes through a single person, to say, how do we balance the different needs of all these different groups? And it depends a little bit on each person's style. What I found is, so anybody who does kind of multi-stakeholder, you know, facilitation or negotiation, or works in politics or government or in big bureaucracies, it's the same problem. This is just applied to the technology realm, where sometimes like one person is really just going to win because they're the most powerful one. So it becomes a conversation with that person about what they really want, and then trying to slot in what other people want as well. Sometimes it's, you know, you have two competing interests who are both like very strong-willed and strong-headed, and the best thing to do is to get them in dialogue with each other and negotiate directly to each other. Sometimes it's about going away with all of the input from everybody, dreaming up a solution, having like A, B, and C, and then coming and presenting A and getting everyone in a room and having that conversation. You know, often I think it's important to make sure that the person who's doing the facilitation is representing different voices, but ultimately those people need to be accountable for compromise, giving and taking with the other people in the organization. Because ostensibly we're all on the same team, right? Because we're all in the same organization. So I would say there's not really much that's like, there's not much that's like specific to AI in that. I think it's just human. You know, there can be ways to be more influential or to put more pressure. Regulation helps, right? If it's a question of compliance, that will often, people will just go, fine, all right. So sometimes you can rely on some things like that. And sometimes it's a conversation like, hey, if you give me this one, I'll give you that one. And other times there's something a little technical where you might want to build in the possibility for later. So there's a question of making sure that you're building for a future feature and just not telling people necessarily. So if you, whether it's the architecture underlying the system, or you think right now we're using one data set, but we might ultimately want to have 2 or 3 or N data sources, maybe we can just build this in such a way that we could plug things in later. So there's some tricks like that, but generally speaking, I think this is a human problem and not really a technical problem.
All right, and we have one more question from Paul.
We can't hear you, Paul.
Paul, can you please unmute?
Sorry about that. Occupational hazard. It's more of a follow-up to the last question, I guess, and an observation rather than a new question. You said in the presentation that you can never eliminate bias. It's all about recognizing it and controlling it, or controlling for it. It's the same with risk, right? You can never eliminate risk from a system. You can only mitigate it and manage it. But it does seem, particularly with technologies, when risk is identified, it's very often passed on to people who are on the periphery. So socially, economically, geographically. And we can see this in the way that AI has been trained. So the human actors in AI who are responsible for training it are frequently not in the global north. We've seen it with social media, with moderation farms in developing economies. And I just wondered what thoughts you had on that related to the previous question as well, because we can do a lot to mitigate the risk, obviously, but there's clearly an ethical question there if the risk mitigation involves just transferring it to people who are less well off than us. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, such a good question. I think we have to ask ourselves when we build systems whether the problem we're trying to solve actually needs AI or is a technical problem. I think one of the major issues that I have with the tech industry is the kind of techno-solutionism approach, which is that technology can be used to solve anything. You know, give me any problem and I'll solve it with an app or an AI, right? And I think that a lot of the risk that we introduce is because we're not actually aligning the technology to the problem in a way that makes sense. And so it causes these kinds of issues. So I don't know if your question is more about recourse, about what you can do once you identify that, or kind of the use of these systems broadly and the creation of the systems broadly. But I think it makes a lot of sense to think about, you know, privacy by design. Hello. Security by design, right? These kinds of things during the design phase of the AI, of the technology, of the application, of the service, as opposed to at the end. And that's kind of what the Data Nutrition Project is looking to do is, can we move this interrogation investigation upstream, right, to where the design decisions are being made? Because then we can actually catch a lot of things before the harm occurs. Now, to your point, you're never going to be able to, you can't foresee every single possible risk and harm. And that would come at the expense of getting anything launched ever. So I'm not like a anti-tech kind of a representative. I'm not saying, hey, we should just not launch any system ever. But I do think that slowing down a little, which people don't like to hear me say, being more intentional at the design phase makes a lot of sense. And if you're not going to do that, then building into your system a way to log what's happening and to look at what's happening in production and have real resources that are focused on how the system is actually running in production and whether it's harming people is probably a good like second or third, right, option, which is that you at least catch things earlier rather than let them continue on in production for a long time, harming a lot of people. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's what I got.
I wasn't looking for the final answer, just interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, if you have thoughts about that too, it sounds like you think deeply about this. I'd love to, if you have anything you want to add there.
Yeah, not much. So my background is in humanitarian work, so I know of your name from the Center for Humanitarian Data. And there's a huge issue there with the way that data is, the project I'm working on at the moment is around improving data governance, because there's just this huge imbalance of power in the data we collect and how we use it compared to the power that the people that we're working for have. And it's something that I'm struggling with like all the time. How do you create more accountability for people who are giving you their data in those very extreme situations, which might even be life or death. So I don't have any answers, but I think the extreme situations that I see or that I'm working on, they're kind of the edge cases that illuminate the way the entire technological ecosystem has been constructed. Basically, the business logic and the technical logic behind these systems and the way that they disadvantage particular groups. So yeah, I don't have an answer. I just trying to work it through.
Yeah, I think, one thing you might know more about this, or someone here might want to chime in. There's a data policy or regulation just got passed in India that is really shaking things up, where the government is now being seen as the manager of the data and not the owner. And the people, the citizens, are considered to be the owners of their data. And so when you shift that paradigm in your mind of the person who gathers the data owns it versus the person whose data it is owns the data, and everyone else is just managing and holding that data until the time when the person who owns the data wants to do something else with it. What does that do to the system when that's the paradigm? And I don't know if there are, any answers, right? There aren't, and because our systems weren't built this way. It is not a technical problem, right? It's just that that's not how they were built initially. So I think similarly with GDPR and some of the regulations come out of Europe, there's this notion of the right to be forgotten, right? The right to forget. So if you would like your data to be taken out of the system, you should be able to request that. So that's a data subject access request, or DSAR. And the whole industry started scrambling when that happened too, because similarly, if someone says, please take my data out, it's not technically impossible, but that's not the way the systems had been built now for decades. So when I worked on the Gmail team, for example, I know how many places our Gmail was stored around the globe, how many different data centers, in how many different ways. And that wasn't done to be a security nightmare or a privacy nightmare. It was actually done to reflect the most important metric, which was that your email would always be available. So if I'm in Boston and I need my email and the server nearby has crashed, it should be able to reach out to Chicago. And if that's not available, go the other way to London. And if that's not available, start pulling from other places. But redundancy was the most important thing because availability was the metric. Now, if we had built our systems with the notion of people own their data and might want to remove it, we would have architected our systems very differently. But that wasn't how the system was built initially. So I think these kinds of principles and these shifts towards, hey, I own my data as Kasia. And if I allow Google to use my data, they're just managing it for me right now. But I have the right to go and say, I do not want you to manage my data anymore. Give it back to me or destroy it. If that was the guiding principle, how might the world have to re-architect itself? Right. I think these are some, so it's not really answering your question. I don't know how it's going to happen. But if there are requirements like that, these companies have a lot of money and a lot of resources. They will find a way. They'll grumble, but they will find a way to comply with them. And that will start to rectify some of these issues that I think we see in today's systems.
That's exactly the approach that we're taking. In fact, data stewardship, which has been developed, this idea that's being developed by a couple of different research institutes where you're just the steward of the data rather than the owner of it. You're stewarding it on behalf of the people who've given it to you. But it's an uphill struggle, as you say. Everything is designed in the opposite direction, both in the profit and for-profit and the non-profit world. But yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, and I think the emergence of this kind of middle person, right, who is a data steward or the data agent, right, who's acting on behalf of a community or a person who wants to take their data out. You know, this is also the case in the US when we think about the indigenous tribes and the sovereign nations who might say, we don't want our citizens' data to be involved in that project. Well, there needs to be some intermediary that then goes and works with all the different agencies to pull it back. And maybe the emergence of middle people is an indication of a broken system. But I think the system's already so broken that if this allows us to move a step more towards people owning their data, then it's not a terrible thing. I see also there's something in the comment. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, yeah, we can switch to. I just wanted to jump in before we move on to the. I think it will be the last question, the one in the comments, just because it is related to what you just discussed. Because you mentioned that we are going towards the regulation. Definitely, the regulation is happening, and it will happen. It depends on the country. It depends which kind of regulation each country, which you showed on the graph with the circles. But it will be regulated. That's the conclusion. But my question is, before regulation, now we are seeing now with AI, especially with ChatGPT and generative AI, we see it's the wild west. So examples are many, from educational system to let's say cultural sector and arts with the issues of copyright and so on. Like on so many levels and in so many different areas, there are really huge impacts and huge problems. So before the regulation comes, what can we do now to mitigate all these impacts, which are not so positive?
Yeah, I mean, my hope is, I'll kind of like sort of answer your question. My hope is that we become literate with these tools and recognize that AI like GPT, like other tools that are going to emerge, are just tools. They're not a solve all. And so we will become more adept at determining when and how to use AI and when not to. Right. I think that this kind of also gets to the comment that's in the chat about, you know, creativity disappearing around the edges because everyone's using the same middle path. And I feel like my hope is that we sooner rather than later, as a society, as as cultures that use technology start to recognize these are the cases in which we should be using these tools because they are beneficial with low risk. And these are the places where we just shouldn't use these tools. And maybe that's in certain kinds of creative production. Maybe that's in, just because we can use it in these situations does not mean that we should, or that it's the best answer for humanity. And so I think that to your question about what we can do before regulation, there has to be a growing cultural awareness and kind of intelligence, human intelligence, about when to use artificial intelligence. And my hope is that these things happen kind of at the same time. So we have cultural norms about when and how to be using AI. And we'll also then have regulation that ends up supporting that or underscoring that or kind of pushing us faster in that direction. And then I guess the question here in the chat, give me 1 second to read it because it looks like it's got lots of great information in it.
Can you please read it aloud, or I can do it?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, because I'm not sure if it will show in the in the.
Great point. Sorry about that. Yes. So there's a comment from Ivana saying, going back to the metrics note, the industry that I work in, which is advertising, the metrics are certainly the problem. We already use quite a few AI solutions to automate and optimize creative work. The problem is it gets optimized against the metrics of success, which is mostly around engagement. So that leads us to the creative work getting worse and worse over time because it's giving you more of the same and taking out the edge or the real creativity of the equation. I think we should actually try to allow for some way of going beyond metrics or allowing some sort of error or spontaneity to break into the AI system to allow it to evolve and grow, not only just work with historical patterns. Interesting. What thoughts do you have about this? Would it be technically possible? First of all, I don't think it's a technical problem. I do think that technically these kinds of things are possible. Now, whether it's technically possible for an AI to create its own thing that's never seen before, not quite as possible, right? I mean, you can increase or introduce some kind of noise or error for sure. But like I said before, whatever it was trained on, that's the universe it knows. And if you really want it to go beyond that, what it returns to you, it's not guaranteed to make any sense at all. It starts to break some of the paradigms, which maybe is what you're looking for. I think that the creative application of AI and the kind of operational or logistics type of implementation of AI are very different. And I do think that there's a lot of creativity that can be supported or maybe sparked through the use of AI that can really help a human in exploring new things or new directions. And can be worked as kind of a partner, right? You can work with it as kind of a partner to help do something and guide you in a new direction. I think it does. I don't know that we're entirely there yet, but it is quite telling to me that before you had GPT, the first folks who were really using AI in a generative fashion were the folks doing stuff with DALL-E or Midjourney. They were the artists, the folks who were doing creative writing projects and seeing how to break the machine and all this kind of thing, right? As we move towards using AI more and more for logistics and operational things that are more manageable and stable and reliable and reproducible, right? That I think tends in the direction that's completely opposite from the creative direction. One of the big challenges that I've been seeing in the work I've been doing with generative AI, so I'm helping some folks build chatbots because I'm curious basically about how they work, is that the way that we've built test suites in the past, so you have code and you have a test, and every time you deploy the code, you run the test and you expect a certain outcome. And if you don't get that outcome, you've failed the test and you can't deploy the code. Because the way that we've written code is very stable, right? There's a particular outcome. The problem with some of this generative stuff is that every time it answers, it's different. So how do you write a test for that? How do you actually operationalize and build stable AI based on generative AI services? It's actually a really interesting problem. So I think what you're pointing out here is that maybe on the creative side, there are opportunities to partner with AI or use AI to spark human creativity as opposed to replace it. And I don't even know that you then need a metric necessarily. It's about the human saying whether or not it's useful and good. On the other side, I do think we need stability metrics and safety metrics to start to measure the output of generative AI in a direction of whether it is actually useful for humans and it's actually meaningful, meaning that we can use it in a stable way, right? And that I think is kind of in the other direction of what you're talking about. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. If we don't have any more questions, do we?
Something just came in. Let me see. My big concern, this is Mikhail and Anna. My big concern is the data from educational organizations. Education's always been about processing data and assessment, and with AI, it can be very powerful, especially when the data can be collected and stored by the state stakeholders who can potentially break the system of checks and balances and convert national educational agencies to data-driven, not ethics or policies-driven institutions. Yeah, definitely. And I've been seeing some teaching tools and some assistants, kind of AI assistants that seem to be, actually, let me say this a different way. In the US, at least, I'm familiar with kind of the burnout of teachers and the fact that teachers are often struggling just to make sure that the schools are running and the kids are learning something, that they're coming to class and all these types of things. And I think that it's especially dangerous to introduce AI into a system that's fairly broken. And that might just be a US perspective, because then people are just quite desperate to use AI for anything that's going to make their life a little bit better. And that's when you start to cut corners. I think you also saw this in the pandemic, right? Massive opportunity in online education. Everyone's going virtual who can. Huge digital divide and discrepancy between who has access to the technology and the internet and who doesn't. You have families who just have one tablet, but they have 3 kids. What are they going to do if all 3 of them are in virtual school? And so there was a ton of innovation that happened during that time, but often at the expense of things like privacy and security of kids' data. And we're talking about children, right? Very, very highly sensitive. So I know you're pointing out states, and I do think that is a dangerous thing. If the state decides to break its own glass to reach in and take a look at these assessment data for things that are maybe more nefarious or malicious, I would say I'm equally concerned about corporations having kids' data, making decisions based on that, especially with the very limited amount of regulation that we have in the US about privacy. Actually, one of the only things we have is about kids' privacy. But yeah, I have like no solution to this. I'm just saying like +1. And I would say also corporations, not just states. But if you want to jump in and say something about this as well, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Okay, just thank you. You listen to me monologue a bit and you're like, okay, fine.
Okay, thank you, Kasia, very much. Yeah, we are now in our time slot, kind of time to wrap it up. And what a way to finish our lecture series. Again, thank you so much for both your presentation and the discussion. And also thanks, of course, everyone who joined us today and who followed our series in the past year and a half. So that's all. And as I said in the beginning, all the lectures are available at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory's YouTube channel. So you can, again, see them there. And hopefully we will turn all these lectures into the book. So yeah, thank you all and bye. Bye from
Fantastic.
us.
Thanks so much and happy holiday season to folks.
Oh, you too.
Take care.
Yeah, you too. Bye.